His tail was back. He was sure of it. He felt a stab of elation, and the octagons had adrenaline mingling with something else. "You're enjoying this," he thought. "You're crazy." Because in some weird way, and very appropriate way, it was like a run in the Matrix. Get just wasted enough, or find yourself in some desperate but strangely arbitrary kind of trouble, and it was positive to see Nancy as a field of data, the way the Matrix had once reminded him of proteins linking to distinguished cell specialties. Then you could throw yourself into a high-speed drift and skid, totally engaged, but set apart from it all. And all around the dance of biz, information interlacing, data made flesh, the mazes of the black market. "Do it, Case," he told himself. "Suck him in. Last thing they'll expect." He was half a block from the games arcade where he'd first met Linda Lee. He bolted across Nancy, scattering a pack of strolling sailors. One of them screamed after him in Spanish. Then he was through the entrance, the sound crashing over him like surf, the subsonics throbbing in the pit of his stomach. Someone scored a 10-megaton hit on Tank Warrior Europa, a simulated airburst drowning the arcade with a white sound as a lurid hologram fireball mushroomed overhead. He cut to the right and hopped up a flight of unpainted... He cut to the right and looped up a flight of unpainted clipboard stairs. He'd come here once with Wage to discuss a deal in prescribed hormonal triggers with a man called Masuga. He remembered the hallway, its stained mattings, its row of identical doors leading to tiny little cubicles. One door was open now. A Japanese girl in a sleeveless black t-shirt glanced up from a white terminal. Behind her head, a travel poster of Greece, blue splashed with streamlined ideograms. "Get your security up here," Case told her. Then he sprinted down the corridor out of her sight. The last two doors were closed in, he assumed, locked. He spun and slammed the sole of his nylon shoe into the blue lacquered composition door at the far end. It popped, cheap hardware falling from the splintered frame. Darkness there, and a white curve of the terminal housing. Then he was on the door to his right, both hands around in a translucent plastic knob, lining it with everything he had. Something snapped, and he was inside. This was where he and Wage had met Masuga, but whatever front company. Masuga had operated was long gone. No terminal, nothing. Light from the alley behind the arcade filtering through the suit-blown plastic. He made out a snake-like loop of fiber optics protruding from a wall socket, a pile of discarded food containers, and the bladeless nacelle of an electric fan. The window was a single pane of cheap plastic. He shrugged out of his jacket, bundled it round his right hand, and punched. It split, requiring 2 more blows to free it from its frame. Over the muted chaos of the games, no alarm began the cycle, triggered either by the broken window or by the girl at the head of the corridor. Case turned, pulled his jacket on, and flicked the Cobra to full extension. With the door closed, he was counting on his tail to assume he'd gone through the one he'd kicked half off its hinges. The Cobra's bronze pyramid began to bob gently, the spring steel shaft applying his pulse. Nothing happened. There was only the surging of the alarm, the crashing of the games, his heart hammering. When the fear came, it was like some half-forgotten friend. Not the cold, rapid mechanicism of Dex paranoia, but simply animal fear. He'd lived for so long on a constant edge of anxiety that he'd almost forgotten what fear was. The cubicle was the sort of place where people died. He might die here. They might have guns. A crash from the far end of the corridor. A man's voice shouting something in Japanese. A scream. Shrill horror. Another crash. And footsteps. Unhurried. coming closer. Passing the choked door, passing for the space of 3 rapid beats of his heart, and returning. 1, 2, 3. A boot heel scraped the matting. The last of his octagon-induced bravado collapsed. He snapped the cobra into its handle and scrambled for the window, blind with fear, his nerves screaming. He was up, out, and falling, all before he was conscious of what he'd done. The impact with pavement drove dull knobs of pain through his shins. A narrow wedge of light from a half-open service hatch framed a hoop of discarded fiber optics in the chassis of a junked console. He'd fallen face forward on a slab of soggy clipboard. He rolled over into a shadow of the console. The cubicle's window was a square of faint light. The alarm still oscillated. Louder here, the rear wall dulling the roar of the game. A head appeared, framed in the window, backlit by the fluorescence in the corridor. Then it vanished. It returned, but he still couldn't read its features. A glint of silver across the eyes. "Shit," someone said, a woman in the accent of the southern sprawl. The head was gone. Case lay under the console for a long count of 20, then stood up. The steel cobra was still in his hand, and it took him a few seconds to remember what it was. He limped away down the alley, nursing his left ankle. Shin's pistol was a 50-year-old Vietnamese imitation of a South American copy of a Walther PPK. Double action on the first shot, and with a very rough pull. It chambered for a .22 long rifle, and Case would have preferred a lead-izide explosive for the simple Chinese hollow points Shin had sold him. Still, it was a handgun, and 9 rounds of ammunition, and he made his way down Chiba from the sushi stall he cradled in his jacket pocket. The grips were bright red plastic modeled in the raised dragon motif, something to run your thumb across in the dark. He'd consigned the cobra to a dump canister in Nensi and dry swallowed another octagon. The pill lit his circuits, and he rode the rush down Shiga to Nensi, then over to Badutsi. His tail, he decided, was gone, and that was fine. He had calls to make, biz to transact, and it wouldn't wait. It blocked down to Basutsi. Toward the port stood a featureless 10-story office building of ugly yellow brick. Its windows were dark now, but a faint glow from the roof was visible. If you craned your neck. An unlit neon sign near the main entrance offered Cheap Hotel under a cluster of ideograms. If the place had another name, Case didn't know it. It was always referred to as Cheap Hotel. He reached it through an alley off of Batsutsi, where an elevator waited at the foot of a transparent shaft. The elevator, like Cheap Hotel, was an afterthought, lashed onto the building with bamboo and epoxy. Case climbed into the plastic cage and used his key, an unmarked length of rigid magnetic tape. Case had rented a coffin here on a weekly basis since he'd arrived in Chiba, but he'd never slept in Cheap Hotel. He only slept in cheaper places. The elevator smelled of a perfume and cigarettes. The sides of the cage were scratched and thumb-smudged. As it passed the 5th floor, he saw the lights of Ninsi. He drummed his fingers against the pistol grip as the cage slowed to a gradual hiss. As always, it came to a full stop with a violent jolt, but he was ready for it. He stepped out into the courtyard and served the place as some combination of lobby and lawn.